My brother Malik sent a message to our family group chat that read, "You showing up will ruin everything. Lauren wants a perfect high society wedding. Keep your weird kid away too. He is going to have one of his episodes and embarrass us. Just stay away." I did not even type a response at first. I simply froze every credit line with my name attached. 4 days later, at the luxury wedding venue, his card declined for an $85,000 catering bill, and my mother was calling my phone over and over. "My name is Carmen. I am 32 years old, and I am a forensic accountant. Before I tell you how I brought my toxic family's fake empire crashing to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace from people who should have protected you." The glowing screen of my phone illuminated the dark interior of my car. I sat in my driveway with my hands gripping the steering wheel. My 7-year-old son Leo was humming a happy tune in the back seat with his noise-canceling headphones securely over his ears. I stared at the message Malik had just sent. The words burned themselves into my memory. "Keep your weird kid away." I did not blink. I did not cry. The tears had dried up 5 years ago when my parents told me that choosing to raise a neurodivergent child as a single mother was a stain on our family's pristine image. My parents, Vernon and Patricia, were the absolute epitome of Atlanta's elite upper crust, or at least they desperately wanted everyone to believe that. To them, my brother Malik was the golden boy. He was the charismatic entrepreneur destined for greatness. I was just the quiet auditor who worked too many hours, talked too little, and birthed a child who did not fit into their country club brochures. Malik was marrying Lauren this weekend. Lauren came from an old money family that owned a string of luxury car dealerships. She was wealthy, entitled, and deeply superficial. She had spent the last 2 years treating me like the hired help and making subtle, cruel comments about my son. My finger hovered over the keyboard. I could have typed a furious paragraph. I could have reminded them all that I had personally secured the vendor contracts for this massive wedding. I could have demanded respect for my son. Instead, I typed 3 simple words. "No worries. Enjoy." I hit send and dropped the phone into my purse. I pulled my secure banking laptop from my work bag and opened it right there in the driver's seat. As a forensic accountant, I track missing money for corporate giants. Finding financial loopholes is my specialty. For 3 years, Malik had been living the life of a self-made tech mogul. He drove a leased sports car, wore custom-tailored suits, and wined and dined Lauren at 5-star restaurants. What Lauren did not know, and what my parents conveniently ignored, was that his entire lifestyle was funded by my pristine credit score. When Malik's first startup went bankrupt, my father had begged me to add him as an authorized user on my elite corporate accounts. He claimed it was just to help his son build his credit back. Like a dutiful daughter seeking crumbs of affection, I had agreed. I set strict internal limits at the beginning. But over the years, those limits had been stretched. The lines of credit had blurred. My parents co-signed for some of his loans, but my social security number anchored the core platinum accounts holding his precious businesses together. I clicked on the master dashboard. 4 platinum credit lines blinked back at me. The total available balance was $150,000. I did not hesitate for a single second. I clicked the first account and changed the status to frozen. I clicked the second account and hit freeze. I went to the third and the fourth. Frozen. Frozen. I disabled the overdraft protection on the shared checking account. I permanently revoked his authorized user privileges. In less than 45 seconds, my brother's net worth went from Silicon Valley prodigy to exactly what he actually was. He was a 35-year-old fraud with zero liquid assets. "Are we going to Uncle Malik's party?" Mommy Leo asked from the back seat. He adjusted his headphones and looked out the window. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. His bright and observant eyes were entirely too pure for the toxicity of the people who shared our bloodline. "Not today, baby," I said as I put the car in reverse. "We are going to let them enjoy their party all by themselves. We are going to get the biggest ice cream sundaes we can find." 4 days passed in absolute silence. I went to work at my firm. I took Leo to his occupational therapy sessions. I drank my morning coffee and lived my life. My phone remained dead quiet. There were no apologies for calling my son weird. There were no check-ins from my mother. There was just the deafening silence of a family that had successfully excised their biggest embarrassment. They thought they had won. Until Thursday afternoon arrived. It was the day of the grand rehearsal dinner and the deadline for the final vendor payments. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a risk assessment file when my phone suddenly lit up. The caller identification flashed with my mother's name. I let it ring. It stopped. Then it rang again. And again. By the fifth consecutive call, I picked it up and answered. I put the phone on speaker while keeping my eyes on my computer screen. "Hello," I said calmly. "Carmen, what did you do?" My mother's voice was a hysterical shriek. It was completely devoid of her usual refined country club drawl. In the background, I could hear the echoing acoustics of a grand ballroom and a woman crying very loudly. The venue manager was shouting. I knew immediately that the perfect illusion had finally shattered into a million pieces. I smiled at my screen. The real revenge had only just begun for all of them now. I let the phone ring until it finally went to voicemail. I waited exactly 3 minutes before accessing the message system. I wanted to let them sweat a little bit longer. When I pressed play, my mother Patricia sounded like she was actively hyperventilating. Her voice was shrill and cracking with pure panic. She sounded stripped of her usual refined country club drawl. "Carmen, you need to call the bank right this second. The venue coordinator just ran your brother's cards for the final $85,000 payment. Every single card declined. The bank says the master accounts are frozen. You need to fix this right now. Lauren's parents are standing right here watching this happen. The coordinator is threatening to cancel the entire weekend and lock us out of the grand ballroom if the wire does not clear in 20 minutes. Call the fraud department before you give your father a heart attack. Fix this right now." I listened to her frantic breathing at the end of the message and then I deleted the voicemail. I did not call the bank to clear any fraud alert. I did not call her back to offer empty reassurances. I simply closed my laptop and placed it into my leather tote bag. It was finally time to make an appearance. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet doors. For years, my mother had relentlessly criticized my wardrobe. She always told me that I dressed too severely and like a boring accountant. Today, I chose a tailored emerald green suit that fit me perfectly. I slipped on a pair of designer heels that I purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like the quiet family scapegoat anymore. I looked like the woman who held their entire financial existence in the palm of her hand. I walked down the hallway to Leo's room. He was sitting on his rug, lining up his toy cars in straight rows. He was completely at peace in his own beautiful world. "Hey, buddy," I said softly to him. "We are going to take a very quick ride. It might be a little loud where we are going, so we need to bring your special headphones." He nodded happily and let me place the thick noise-canceling headphones securely over his ears. I took his small hand in mine and we walked out to my waiting car together. The drive to the estate took about 40 minutes. My mind was now completely clear. I was operating with the cold precision of an auditor who had just uncovered a massive discrepancy. The venue was a sprawling historic mansion situated on acres of private land. It was surrounded by botanical gardens and massive imported marble fountains that sprayed clear water into the air. It was the kind of exclusive estate that required a 6-figure minimum deposit just to secure a date. As I pulled my car into the circular driveway, I could already see physical cracks in my family's facade. A delivery van from a luxury bakery was idling near the sweeping front steps. The driver was leaning heavily against the side of his truck. He was flatly refusing to unload a massive 6-tier wedding cake until he received his final payment. I parked my car in a visitor spot and unbuckled Leo from his safety seat. I made sure his headphones were sitting comfortably. We walked up the wide limestone steps together. Even through the heavy mahogany double doors, I could hear the shouting echoing from inside the building. I placed my hand on the brass handle, pushed the doors open, and stepped directly into the grand foyer. It was a scene of spectacular and absolute destruction. Towering arrangements of white orchids and imported peonies were sitting half-assembled on the pristine marble floor. A large team of professional florists stood nearby, refusing to place another single stem until their invoices were cleared. The catering staff had completely abandoned their silver serving carts near the entrance of the main ballroom. In the center of the massive room stood my family. Malik was sweating profusely through his custom tuxedo shirt. He was frantically tapping at his phone screen and running his hands over his head in panic. Patricia was fanning herself aggressively with a thick wedding program. Her face was a shade of blotchy red, and she looked like she might physically collapse at any moment. The illusion of their flawless high society life was rapidly unraveling in front of wealthy vendors and elite country club socialites. Lauren's family members were huddled together in the far corner, whispering aggressively to each other and shooting dirty looks at my mother. Malik kept trying to assure the venue manager that it was just a simple banking error. He lied smoothly, claiming his accounts were flagged for fraud because he traveled frequently for his tech company. The manager looked completely unimpressed while holding a declining credit card receipt. I stood near the entrance, watching the disaster unfold before my eyes. I did not say a word to announce my presence. I held Leo's hand tightly and observed their panic. The desperation radiating from my brother was a stark contrast to the arrogant message he had sent me 4 days ago. He demanded I stay away to preserve his perfect image. Now his image was bleeding out onto the marble floor. I took a few steps further into the grand foyer. The soft click of my heels echoed sharply against the stone tiles. My father Vernon was the first one to spot me. He had been arguing with a security guard near the coat check desk. When his eyes locked onto mine, his expression contorted with violent rage. His face turned a deep shade of crimson and the veins in his neck bulged. He dropped his conversation completely. He abandoned the security guard and turned toward me. He did not look relieved to see his daughter. He looked like a man who wanted to destroy an insubordinate employee. His hands balled into tight fists. He took a heavy step in my direction. Then he began charging across the lobby floor, making a straight line right toward me and my son. My father stopped barely 2 inches from my face, his chest heaving with suppressed anger. He did not say hello to me. He did not ask how his grandson was doing. He did not acknowledge that he had not spoken to me in months. He simply pointed a trembling finger at my designer leather tote bag and ordered me to pull out my phone right this second. He spoke to me with the exact same condescending tone he used when reprimanding junior staff members at his accounting firm. He told me my bank mistakenly placed a massive fraud alert on Malik's corporate cards. He said the venue coordinator was threatening to call the local police for theft of services if the $85,000 catering bill was not settled immediately. He demanded that I log into the banking portal and authorize the transaction before Lauren's wealthy family noticed the delay. I did not reach for my bag. I did not break eye contact with him. I kept my hands resting gently but firmly on my son's shoulders, ensuring Leo felt safe in the middle of this chaotic environment. I looked at the man who spent my life making me feel like a secondary citizen, and I smiled a cold smile. I told my father that there was no banking error, and there was absolutely no fraud alert. I told him I personally logged into the system on Sunday night and permanently frozen every line of credit attached to my name. I watched the color drain from my father's face as my words registered. He opened his mouth to scream at me, but I did not give him the chance to interrupt my explanation. I kept my voice perfectly level and highly professional. I reminded him that Malik had sent a very clear message to the family group chat just a few days ago. I recited my brother's exact words from memory. I told my father Malik explicitly banned me from this wedding because he thought my presence would ruin everything. I reminded him that my brother had called my beautiful and brilliant child weird and claimed that we would embarrass this family in front of Lauren and her elite relatives. I told my father that I was simply respecting my brother's wishes by staying far away from his perfect day. I stated that if my son and I were considered a social embarrassment, then my pristine credit score and my hard-earned money were clearly an embarrassment too. My mother Patricia materialized right beside my father. She grabbed his arm and glared at me with absolute disgust. She hissed under her breath, telling me to stop throwing a bitter and jealous tantrum. She demanded that I stop trying to ruin my brother's one chance at true happiness and social elevation. She treated my rational financial decision as if I were a toddler throwing toys. She told me I was humiliating the entire family in front of the country club elite. Before I could explain to my mother that they had humiliated themselves, a piercing shriek echoed through the grand foyer. Everyone in the lobby turned to look at the sweeping marble staircase. Lauren was storming down the steps. She was wearing a custom silk wedding gown that dragged heavily behind her. Her blonde hair was partially pinned up in an elegant style, but her face was twisted in an ugly mask of sheer panic and intense rage. She was practically vibrating with anger as she yelled for Malik. She screamed that the head florist had just instructed his team to dismantle the massive floral arch they had spent 3 hours building. She yelled that the executive catering chef was threatening to pack up the Wagyu beef and the imported lobster tails because the payment terminal had declined 4 different platinum cards in a row. Lauren reached the bottom of the staircase and marched directly toward our tense little circle. She grabbed Malik by the arm of his tailored tuxedo. She demanded to know why he was standing around doing nothing while her perfect wedding was literally falling apart in front of her wealthy parents. Malik looked like a cornered animal, realizing his trap had finally closed. He was sweating so much that his collar was damp, and his eyes kept darting frantically between his furious bride and my calm expression. Then Lauren finally noticed me standing there. She paused her frantic rant and looked me up and down with deep disdain. She took in my tailored emerald green suit and the small boy wearing noise-canceling headphones standing quietly by my side. She did not recognize me because Malik had carefully kept our worlds completely separate for the last 2 years. Lauren sighed dramatically and rolled her eyes at my presence. She turned back to Malik and asked him why he was wasting time arguing with the venue help when he needed to be on the phone with his wealth manager to fix this disaster. She actually called me the help. The racial microaggression hung heavily in the tense air of the lobby. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger in my direction and told Malik to tell the coordinator, or whoever I was, to get out of the main lobby immediately because my kid was ruining the sophisticated aesthetic she had planned for her pre-wedding photographs. My father stood completely frozen in place. My mother suddenly found the intricate pattern of the marble floor to be incredibly interesting to look at. They both knew exactly what was about to happen, and they were entirely powerless to stop the incoming destruction. Malik stepped directly between me and his beautiful bride. He held his hands up in a desperate and placating gesture. He tried to speak softly, hoping Lauren would not hear the absolute terror shaking his voice. He begged me to just leave the building right now. He whispered that he would pay me back every single penny with interest if I just unlocked the master accounts for 5 minutes so the transaction could clear. He promised to apologize to Leo tomorrow morning. He promised to do whatever I wanted if I just saved his life right now. I gently moved my brother aside. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the furious bride. Lauren crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me, waiting for me to apologize for being in her presence. I looked Lauren directly in the eyes. I told her that I was not the venue coordinator, and I certainly was not the help. I introduced myself clearly and professionally. I told her my name was Carmen and that I was Malik's younger sister. I watched her expression shift from annoyance to total confusion. She frowned and asked why Malik's sister was causing a scene with the payment terminal on her wedding day. I smiled at her with genuine satisfaction. I unclasped my leather tote bag and reached inside. I pulled out a thick bound audit file with a bright red cover. I told Lauren that I was not causing a scene with the terminal. I told her I was simply the primary cardholder of the 4 accounts funding this entire wedding. I watched her eyes widen in absolute shock as I delivered the final truth. I told her that Malik was not a self-made tech millionaire. I told her I was the primary cardholder of his entire fake life. Lauren stared at me with her mouth slightly open. The illusion of her perfect wedding was breaking apart in front of her eyes. She looked at my brother. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She asked Malik why his sister claimed to own the cards that paid for their luxury life. Malik let out a loud, nervous laugh that echoed across the marble lobby. He ran a shaking hand over his face and stepped closer to his bride. He told Lauren not to listen to me. He pointed his finger at me and told Lauren that I was completely insane. He tried to gaslight everyone in the room. He claimed that I was just a bitter and broke single mother. He said I was deeply jealous of his massive success and his beautiful relationship. He told Lauren's wealthy family that I had hacked into his corporate banking portal out of pure spite. He said I illegally froze his assets just to ruin the most important day of his life because I could not keep a man of my own. He painted himself as the innocent victim of a jealous sister. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger. I just looked at him with absolute pity. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the bound audit file with the red cover. I stepped past him and handed the heavy file to Lauren. She took it with trembling hands. Her manicured fingers flipped the cover open. I told Lauren to look at the first page. I explained that I was a senior forensic accountant. I told her I tracked missing money for a living. I told her the documents she was holding were certified bank records and federal tax filings. I watched her eyes dart across the page as I explained the reality of her romance. I told Lauren that 3 years ago, Malik's tech startup completely collapsed. I explained that he was entirely bankrupt and facing massive legal debts. He had absolutely zero liquid assets and a destroyed credit score. I told her that my brother did not build a new software empire. He simply stole my social security number. He used my pristine credit history to open 4 platinum corporate accounts. Lauren looked sick. She flipped to the next page of the audit file while her breathing became fast. I told her that every single luxury item they owned was financed by my identity. I told her that his leased sports car was in my name. I told her that his luxury penthouse apartment was secured using my financial credentials. I looked down at her hand and told her that the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger was purchased on my platinum credit line. I told her the $85,000 deposit for this wedding venue was authorized by me. He was not a self-made millionaire. He was a master manipulator who stole his own sister's identity to fund a fake life. Lauren dropped the heavy file onto the marble floor. It landed with a loud smack. She looked at Malik with pure disgust. She asked him if it was true. Malik opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked absolutely terrified. Before he could formulate another lie, my parents stepped forward to shield their precious golden boy. My father, Vernon, puffed out his chest and tried to intimidate me. He told Lauren that Malik did not steal anything. He claimed that the family allowed Malik to use my credit profile. He said they gave Malik permission to leverage my assets because he was going through a tough transition period. My mother, Patricia, quickly agreed with him. She stepped right up to my face and glared at me with pure hatred. She said Malik needed to maintain his elite image. She explained that he had to look highly successful so he could impress Lauren's old money family and secure his place in high society. She said appearances were everything in their world. She told Lauren that it was completely normal for wealthy families to share financial resources to protect their legacy. Then my mother turned her vicious anger toward me. She called me a selfish and vindictive person for bringing this up today. She said, "Family protects family no matter what." She demanded that I pick up the audit file and leave the venue immediately. She told me to take my weird kid and go back to my miserable, lonely life so Malik could marry the woman of his dreams. She said my refusal to play along with the illusion was destroying the Black excellence legacy she and my father had spent decades building. I looked at my parents and realized they were completely delusional. They actually believed that committing federal wire fraud and identity theft was perfectly acceptable as long as it kept Malik looking like a wealthy entrepreneur. They were willing to sacrifice my financial future and my son's security just to keep up a fake rich lifestyle in front of a white country club family. Lauren backed away from Malik as if he were carrying a deadly disease. Her wealthy parents were whispering frantically to each other in the corner of the lobby. Her father looked like he was preparing to unleash a massive lawsuit against my entire family. Malik dropped to his knees and tried to grab Lauren's hands. He begged her to listen to him. He swore that he was about to close a massive tech deal that would pay off all the credit cards and make them truly rich. He promised her the world if she would just ignore the stolen money and marry him today. Before Lauren could process the fact that her perfect groom was a broke fraud, the heavy wooden doors of the main ballroom swung open with a loud bang. Everyone in the lobby stopped yelling and turned to look. The general manager of the luxury estate marched directly into the grand foyer. He was not smiling anymore. His face was set in a hard, rigid line of pure authority. He was flanked by two very large armed security guards wearing dark uniforms. The general manager was gripping a crackling police radio tightly in his right hand. The general manager of the luxury estate marched directly into the grand foyer. He was not smiling anymore. His face was set in a hard, rigid line of pure authority. He was flanked by two very large armed security guards wearing dark uniforms. The general manager was gripping a crackling police radio tightly in his right hand. He stopped dead in the center of the marble floor, and his security guards crossed their arms. They stared directly at my father, who immediately backed away from me and lowered his fists. Before the venue manager could even raise the radio to his mouth to call the local authorities, an older man pushed his way violently through the crowd of stunned wedding guests. It was Richard. He was Lauren's father, and he was the patriarch of a massive regional automotive empire. He walked with the heavy and aggressive entitlement of a man who was used to buying his way out of any minor inconvenience. He wore a silver silk suit that probably cost more than my first car. He stood next to his crying daughter and glared at my family with absolute revulsion. He told Malik that he was completely sick of watching this ghetto spectacle unfold in front of his prestigious business partners. He said that Lauren deserved a flawless wedding day, and he was not going to let a pathetic domestic dispute ruin his daughter's happiness. Richard reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a heavy titanium black card. He shoved it directly into the chest of the venue manager. He commanded the manager to run the card for the full $85,000 catering balance and to add an extra $10,000 as a tip for the sheer inconvenience of this situation. He then turned to the security guards and told them to escort my family out the back doors so the civilized guests could finally enjoy their expensive champagne reception. Malik let out a massive and audible breath of relief. He actually smiled at me. He thought he had won. He thought his wealthy father-in-law had just saved his fake empire and banished me from the premises. The general manager nodded stiffly. He took the heavy black card and signaled for a catering assistant to bring over the wireless payment terminal. The grand foyer was so quiet that the electronic beeping of the machine sounded like a fire alarm. The manager swiped the titanium card through the reader. We all stood in complete silence waiting for the approval receipt to print. Instead, the machine let out a loud and continuous negative beep. The general manager looked down at the bright red screen. He cleared his throat and looked directly at Richard. He told the wealthy patriarch that the card was completely declined. Richard snatched the machine out of the manager's hands. His face turned a deep and angry shade of purple. He started shouting that a decline was absolutely impossible. He yelled that his primary accounts held tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets. He demanded that they run the card again and threatened to buy the entire estate just to fire the general manager on the spot. He pulled out a second Elite Platinum card and shoved it into the terminal. The machine beeped negatively again. Declined. Richard looked like he was losing his mind. He pulled out his phone to call his elite wealth management firm. He screamed into the receiver demanding to know why his personal banking lines were suddenly restricted on his daughter's wedding day. I stood quietly watching the powerful man completely unravel. I took a slow and deliberate step forward. I told Richard that he did not need to scream at his customer service representative. I told him he should probably look at the red audit file currently sitting on the marble floor near his daughter's feet. Richard hung up his phone and glared at me. He demanded to know who I was and why I was speaking to him. I kept my voice perfectly calm and professional. I told him my name was Carmen and I was a senior forensic accountant. I told him that my firm specialized in tracking vanished corporate funds and massive financial discrepancies for extremely high net worth individuals. I told Richard that his accounts were not frozen because of a simple banking error. I explained that last month my firm was hired by a silent third-party partner to quietly audit his primary investment portfolio. I watched his arrogant expression falter and crack. I told him we were brought in because someone noticed massive hemorrhaging from his liquid asset accounts. I looked over at Malik, who was now slowly backing toward the massive exit doors. The two armed security guards immediately stepped sideways and completely blocked his path. I turned my attention back to Richard. I told him that I had spent the last 3 weeks tracing a very specific $2 million angel investment he had made. Richard looked at Malik with wild eyes. He told me that the $2 million was seed money for Malik's revolutionary new software platform. He said Malik showed him the beta testing and the projected financial returns. He claimed the investment was perfectly secure and managed by top-tier brokers. I smiled at him with genuine pity. I told Richard that there was no revolutionary software platform. I told him there was no tech startup at all. I explained that Malik took that $2 million angel investment and funneled it directly into a complex web of offshore shell companies. I told him that the money did not go into software development. It went to paying off the massive debts from his previous bankruptcies. It went to funding the illusion of a wealthy lifestyle so he could trick Lauren's family into trusting him. I told Richard that Malik used his stolen investment money to lease the luxury cars and rent the penthouse. He used the $2 million to buy the expensive dinners and the designer clothes that convinced Richard he was a successful equal. I explained that my brother had essentially run a massive Ponzi scheme right under his nose. Malik was taking money from Richard's own investment portfolio to pay for the illusion that he belonged in their elite world. When those stolen funds started running low, he resorted to stealing my social security number to open the corporate credit cards that were currently declining all over the venue. I pointed down at the red audit file on the floor. I told Richard that every single forged document and every fake wire transfer was documented right there in that folder. I told him that the bank had frozen all of his connected accounts this morning because the federal fraud investigation had officially been triggered by my audit. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard stared at me as the horrifying truth finally pierced through his supreme arrogance. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin an awful shade of pale gray. He dropped his phone onto the floor. His hands began to shake violently. He slowly turned his head to look at Malik. The realization that he had just handed $2 million to a con artist who was about to marry his daughter was breaking his mind in real time. He realized the brilliant tech genius he had welcomed into his family was nothing but a desperate fraud who had just dragged their entire wealthy dynasty into a massive federal criminal investigation. Richard stood completely frozen in the center of the grand foyer. His heavy titanium black card hung loosely from his trembling fingers. The absolute silence in the massive room was deafening as the wealthy patriarch finally comprehended the magnitude of his disastrous mistake. He stared at Malik with the hollow and horrified expression of a man who had just watched $2 million of his own private investment capital burn to ashes. He realized his money was gone forever, and the brilliant tech genius he was preparing to welcome into his elite family was actually a desperate criminal. The reality of the Ponzi scheme was hanging heavily in the air, but the quiet tension did not last long. A sudden and piercing scream shattered the silence. It did not come from my parents or my brother or the venue manager. It came from Lauren. She refused to accept the reality of her ruined fairy tale. Her mind simply could not process the fact that her handsome groom had lied to her for years and stolen millions from her own father. Instead of turning her righteous anger toward the man who had completely deceived her, she desperately needed a scapegoat. She projected all of her frantic rage onto the easiest target in the room. She turned her venomous eyes directly toward me and my innocent child. Lauren gathered the heavy silk skirts of her custom wedding gown in her hands and stomped across the marble floor. Her face was twisted into a hideous mask of pure entitlement and fury. She pointed her manicured finger right at my sweet little boy. She completely abandoned whatever shred of high society manners she pretended to possess. She screamed that I was nothing but a jealous and bitter loser who was trying to drag her down because I was obsessed with her perfect life. Then she committed the ultimate and unforgivable sin. She glared at my beautiful son as he stood quietly adjusting his noise-canceling headphones, and she called him a retarded mistake. She yelled that we were a disgusting stain on her perfect day, and that my weird child had ruined the most important moment of her entire privileged life. The cold and calculating forensic accountant inside my brain instantly died. The icy control flowing through my veins turned into boiling fire. I did not care about the general manager holding his police radio or the armed security guards standing nearby. I did not care about my parents watching in horrified shock. I gently pushed my son slightly behind my legs and made absolutely sure his special headphones were resting securely over his ears so he could not hear a single syllable of her toxic poison. Then I moved. I closed the distance between me and the screaming bride in 3 rapid strides. I stepped so deeply into her personal space that she physically stumbled backward in surprise. Her expensive silk gown rustled loudly as her heel caught on the edge of the smooth marble floor. I did not raise my hands, and I did not touch her, but my presence was completely dominating. I looked down into her tear-filled eyes, and I began to verbally tear her superficial existence apart piece by piece. I told Lauren exactly what she was. I called her an empty and spoiled shell of a woman who was so completely desperate for a picture-perfect country club aesthetic that she agreed to marry a walking financial corpse. I told her she was too stupid and too blinded by a leased sports car and designer suits to see that the man she loved was completely hollow. I promised her that my precious son possessed more intelligence and pure grace in his little finger than her entire wealthy bloodline could ever hope to achieve in a lifetime. I told her that her fake privilege and her old money arrogance meant absolutely nothing today. I made sure my voice echoed clearly off the high ceilings, so every single one of her wealthy guests lingering in the nearby hallways could hear the absolute truth of her total humiliation. I told her that while she was busy looking down on me as the hired help, her own father was being robbed blind by the man she chose to sleep with. I promised her that her perfect wedding weekend was going to be the biggest laughingstock in the history of her elite social circle. I told her that her snobby friends would be feasting for decades on the incredible gossip of how the brilliant heiress tried to marry a penniless federal criminal who funded her massive engagement ring with his own sister's stolen social security number. Lauren began to weep hysterically as the reality of her social destruction finally crashed over her. Her heavy bridal makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks, completely ruining her flawless glow. She looked wildly at her father, begging him to do something to fix the disaster and demanding that he make me stop talking. But Richard just stood there staring blankly at the red audit file on the floor, looking like he might need immediate emergency medical attention. Malik took a weak step forward to defend his crying bride, but the 2 massive security guards instantly placed their hands on their utility belts and stepped firmly into his path. My brother shrank back, like the miserable coward he truly was, leaving his bride to face the severe consequences of his actions entirely alone. My parents watched me with terrified expressions. They had spent my entire life trying to silence me and force me into submission for the sake of their image. Now they were forced to witness the absolute destruction of their golden boy's entire future, and they could not utter a single word to stop my wrath. I stared at my mother and father, ensuring they saw the absolute finality and fierce protection in my eyes. Then I turned my attention back to the sobbing bride standing in front of me. Lauren covered her face with her shaking hands and wailed that she had lost absolutely everything. She cried that her beautiful day was ruined and her father's money was gone forever and her life was over. I took a slow step back and smoothed the lapels of my emerald green suit. I looked at her shaking form, and I told her that she had not even reached the bottom of this nightmare yet. I told her that as a forensic accountant, I was extremely thorough by nature. I explained that when I initially found the fraudulent corporate accounts, I made the decision to audit every single legal document attached to my stolen identity just to be safe. I reached my hand back into my leather tote bag. My fingers gripped a second thick folder resting at the bottom. I pulled it out and held it up high under the bright crystal chandeliers for everyone in the lobby to see clearly. It was a bright red folder with bold black letters printed neatly across the front. I looked directly at Lauren and her pale, trembling father, and I told them that before they begged the venue manager not to call the police, they really needed to read the prenup. Lauren stared at the bright red folder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike her directly in the face. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and lifted her chin with that same country club arrogance she had been displaying all morning. She told me that her legal team had drafted an ironclad prenuptial agreement months ago. She proudly stated that her family trust fund and her personal banking assets were completely protected from any outside interference or marital claims. She said Malik signed the papers without a single hesitation because he was already a self-made millionaire and he did not need a single penny of her generational wealth to survive. She actually puffed out her chest and claimed that she was far too smart to ever let a man take advantage of her financial standing. She looked at her father Richard for validation, and he nodded stiffly in agreement. They honestly believed that a piece of paper drawn up by their expensive lawyers made them completely untouchable in this situation. I let her finish her arrogant little speech before I slowly opened the heavy red folder. I pulled out a thick stack of banking records and vendor contracts that were highlighted in bright yellow ink. I told Lauren that she was absolutely right about one specific thing. I agreed that her lawyers did draft a very strict prenuptial agreement that protected her core assets in the event of a standard divorce. I looked at her shaking hands and told her that a prenup only protects her from a legal marital separation settlement. I told her it does absolutely nothing to protect her from joint liability in a massive federal fraud investigation. The color completely drained from Lauren's face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost in a white silk dress. She took a slow step backward and bumped into her father, who was still staring blankly at the marble floor. I held up a copy of the master wedding venue contract that she had signed exactly 3 months ago. I pointed to the bottom of the page where her elegant signature rested right next to Malik's sloppy handwriting. I explained to her that she did not just sign a simple event contract to reserve the grand ballroom and the catering staff. I told her that she legally co-signed a massive financial liability agreement as a joint financial partner for the entire wedding weekend. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the highlighted paragraphs as she tried to process the heavy legal terms. I kept my voice perfectly steady and clear, so every single word would sink deep into her brain. I told Lauren that because Malik was technically bankrupt and hiding from creditors, he could not secure the elite vendor contracts on his own merit. I explained that he used the platinum corporate credit cards, opened under my stolen identity, to pay the initial $85,000 deposit, but he used her pristine credit history and her legal signature to guarantee the massive remaining balance. I told her that by signing those specific vendor documents, she legally commingled her clean financial profile with his fraudulent shell companies. Richard suddenly snapped out of his stunned silence and realized the absolute nightmare his daughter had walked into. He grabbed Lauren's bare shoulder and demanded to know if she had signed any other financial documents with Malik during their relationship. Lauren began to hyperventilate as the panic finally took over her body. She admitted that she co-signed the lease for their luxury penthouse apartment because Malik's corporate accountants told her it would be a brilliant tax write-off for her personal portfolio. She cried that she also co-signed the massive loan for his imported sports car because Malik told her his liquid funds were temporarily tied up in an overseas tech acquisition that was about to pay out millions. I nodded slowly as she confessed to every single foolish mistake she had made in the name of love and greed. I told Lauren that she had basically handed her entire pristine financial future over to a desperate con artist. I pulled out my phone and opened my calculator app to show her the devastating reality. I told her that between the remaining balance for this luxury wedding venue and the immediate creditor liabilities tied to the broken penthouse lease and the fraudulent car loans, she was now legally responsible for exactly $150,000 in debt. I explained that because the initial deposits were all paid with my stolen funds, the federal investigators would be seizing every single asset attached to those accounts immediately. I told her that her precious trust fund might be safe from a divorce court, but her personal bank accounts were about to be drained by angry creditors and federal authorities because she willingly attached her name to a financial crime. Lauren let out a sound that was halfway between a broken sob and a wild scream. The beautiful illusion of her perfect wealthy life was completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces right in front of her prestigious guests. She looked down at Malik with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred that I had never seen before. Malik fell to his knees on the cold marble floor, realizing he had completely lost control of his victim. He reached out with trembling hands and tried to grab the heavy hem of her expensive silk wedding gown. He begged her to listen to him and swore he could fix everything if she just gave him a few days to move some offshore investments around. He was still trying to lie to her face, even as the absolute proof of his crimes was being handed directly to the venue manager and the police. Lauren violently kicked her foot out and knocked his hands away from her pristine dress. She screamed at him to never touch her again. She called him a disgusting parasite and a pathetic liar who had ruined her entire existence for his own selfish gain. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed the massive diamond engagement ring that was sitting heavily on her finger. It was the same ring that was paid for with my stolen identity and ruined credit score. She ripped the heavy diamond off her finger with so much aggressive force that it left a bright red scrape across her skin. She pulled her arm back and threw the diamond ring directly at Malik's face with all the strength she had left. The heavy ring bounced hard off his forehead and clattered loudly across the polished marble floor, sliding all the way to the heavy black boots of the armed security guards. Lauren stood towering over the man she was supposed to marry in less than an hour. She did not shed another tear of sadness. Her face was a solid mask of absolute fury and disgust. She announced to the entire grand foyer that the wedding was completely off. She told Malik that she was going to hire the most ruthless and expensive legal team in the state to make sure he rotted in a federal prison for the rest of his miserable life. She told him he was nothing but a broke loser who tried to steal his way into a world he would never belong in. Richard grabbed his daughter's arm and pulled her aggressively toward the main exit doors. He looked back at my parents one last time and told them they raised an absolute monster. He promised to sue our entire family into complete and total bankruptcy before the year was over. The wealthy father and his ruined bride marched out of the grand foyer, leaving Malik kneeling on the floor in a puddle of his own pathetic lies. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer slammed shut behind Richard and his ruined daughter. The loud thud echoed across the marble floor, leaving a heavy and suffocating silence in its wake. Malik remained on his knees, clutching his head and sobbing into the expensive fabric of his rented tuxedo. The remaining wedding guests were huddled in the corners of the lobby, whispering frantically to each other. The illusion of my brother's perfect life was completely dead. I stood perfectly still, holding the heavy red audit file and looking down at the man who had stolen my financial future. I thought the worst part of the confrontation was finally over. I thought my family would quietly pack up their shame and walk out the back doors in absolute disgrace. I severely underestimated the terrifying depth of my mother's delusion. My mother, Patricia, watched her wealthy future-in-laws walk out the door, and something inside her brain completely snapped. She let out a horrific and guttural scream that sounded like a wounded animal. Her face twisted into a mask of pure and vicious hatred. She did not look at Malik, who was crying on the floor. She did not look at my father, Vernon, who was staring blankly at the wall. She locked her furious eyes directly onto me. She blamed me for the entire disaster. She stomped across the polished marble floor with her hands clenched into tight fists. She was wearing an incredibly expensive silk gown that Malik had supposedly bought for her, but her elegant appearance was completely ruined by the ugly rage contorting her features. Patricia closed the distance between us in a matter of seconds. She raised her right hand high into the air and swung it toward my face with all the violent force she could muster. She wanted to slap the truth right out of my mouth. She wanted to physically punish me for destroying the fake reality she loved so much. I did not flinch, and I did not back away. I had spent my entire childhood absorbing her emotional blows, but I was never going to let her physically strike me again. I raised my left arm and intercepted her wrist in mid-air. I caught her forearm with an effortless and iron grip. The loud smack of my hand catching her wrist echoed off the high ceilings. My mother gasped in absolute shock. She tried to pull her arm away, but I held her wrist firmly in place. I looked directly into her furious eyes, and I did not blink. She realized in that exact moment that the power dynamic between us had permanently shifted. I was no longer the quiet and obedient daughter who would silently take the blame for her golden boy's mistakes. I was a grown woman who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, and I was completely unafraid of her anger. Patricia realized she could not physically overpower me, so she resorted to her favorite weapon. She opened her mouth and unleashed a torrent of vicious verbal abuse. She screamed that I was a disgusting and vindictive traitor. She yelled that I had just single-handedly destroyed our entire family legacy. She pointed her free hand at the whispering guests and cried that I had ruined our standing in high society forever. She said she and my father had spent decades carefully cultivating an image of black excellence and elite success. She claimed that Malik's marriage into a powerful white country club family was supposed to be the ultimate crowning achievement of all their hard work. She blamed me for tearing down that beautiful image just because I was a bitter and lonely single mother who could not stand to see her own brother succeed. She yelled that family was supposed to protect family, no matter what the cost. I listened to her delusional rant without showing a single ounce of emotion. I tightened my grip on her wrist just enough to make her stop shouting. I stepped closer to her and lowered my voice so that it carried a cold and dangerous authority. I told her that her precious legacy of black excellence was nothing but a cheap illusion built on federal wire fraud and stolen identities. I told her she was a complete hypocrite for preaching about family loyalty when she had actively supported the son who stole my social security number and ruined my credit score. I told her that real family does not commit felonies to fund a fake country club lifestyle. I did not stop there. I raised my voice just enough so that the wealthy guests lingering in the lobby could hear every single word I said. I looked at the expensive designer handbag dangling from her shoulder and the sparkling diamond tennis bracelet wrapping around her wrist. I told my mother that I audited every single account associated with Malik's stolen funds. I explained that I tracked the money trail directly to her personal bank accounts. I told the entire lobby that her elite country club membership fees were paid using my stolen credit profile. I revealed that her luxury vacations to the Bahamas and her expensive spa treatments were completely funded by the money Malik embezzled from Lauren's father. My mother turned completely pale as her deepest and darkest secrets were dragged out into the bright light. She tried to deny it, but her voice came out as a weak and pathetic whimper. I told her that she knew Malik was bankrupt 3 years ago. I told her she willingly chose to look the other way when he suddenly started showering her with expensive gifts and luxury trips. I explained that she was perfectly happy to sacrifice my financial security as long as she got to play the role of a wealthy matriarch at her fancy luncheons. She traded her own daughter's future for a designer handbag and a fake social status. The wedding guests began to whisper even louder. A few of them actually pulled out their phones and started recording the spectacular collapse of the groom's family. My father Vernon finally stepped forward and tried to intervene, but he looked completely defeated. He told Patricia to stop talking and begged me to let her go. I released my mother's wrist and pushed her arm away with absolute disgust. She stumbled backward and almost fell onto the marble floor. She looked around the grand foyer and saw the pure revulsion on the faces of the remaining guests. The high society elite she was so desperate to impress were now looking at her like she was a common criminal. I told my parents that their precious golden boy was not a victim. I told them he was a calculating thief who used his own family as collateral damage in his desperate climb to the top. I explained that they were completely complicit in his crimes because they enabled his delusions and protected his lies. I promised them that the federal investigators would be looking very closely at the expensive gifts and cash transfers they accepted from his fraudulent accounts. They had prioritized an illusion over reality, and now they were going to lose absolutely everything they claimed to care about. My mother covered her face with her hands and finally began to cry. It was not a cry of remorse or guilt. It was the selfish and terrified cry of a woman who realized she was about to lose her country club membership and her fake wealthy friends. Malik was still weeping on the floor, completely unable to face the reality of his ruined life. The general manager of the venue stepped forward with his security guards fully prepared to remove my entire family from the premises. But before anyone could take another step, a loud and piercing sound cut through the heavy tension in the grand foyer. It started as a distant wail and quickly grew into a deafening roar. The unmistakable sound of heavy police sirens echoed loudly outside the massive front doors of the luxury estate. The local authorities had finally arrived. The general manager stood frozen in the center of the grand foyer with the heavy police radio gripped tightly in his hand. His two armed security guards crossed their arms and glared at my parents. Before the manager could even raise the radio to his mouth to call the local authorities, a much older man pushed his way violently through the crowd of stunned wedding guests. It was Richard. He was Lauren's incredibly wealthy father and the patriarch of a massive regional real estate empire. He walked with the heavy and aggressive entitlement of a man who was entirely used to buying his way out of any minor inconvenience. He wore a custom-tailored silver silk suit that probably cost more than my entire college education. He stormed across the marble floor and wrapped a protective arm around his sobbing daughter. He pulled Lauren close to his chest and glared at my family with absolute revulsion. He told Malik that he was completely sick and tired of watching this disgusting ghetto spectacle unfold in front of his prestigious business partners. He said that his beautiful daughter deserved a flawless wedding day, and he was absolutely not going to let a pathetic domestic dispute between broke siblings ruin her happiness. Richard did not even look at me when he spoke. He treated me like a pesky insect that needed to be swatted away. He reached his hand deep into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a heavy titanium black card. He shoved the elite credit card directly into the chest of the venue manager. He commanded the general manager to run the card immediately for the full $85,000 catering balance. He then loudly instructed the manager to add an extra $20,000 as a convenience tip, just for having to deal with the sheer embarrassment of my family being on the premises. He turned to the armed security guards and demanded that they escort my parents and me out the back service doors so the civilized guests could finally enjoy their expensive champagne reception in peace. Malik let out a massive and audible breath of relief. My brother actually smiled at me through his nervous sweat. He truly thought he had won. He genuinely believed that his wealthy future father-in-law had just saved his fake empire and banished me from the property forever. The general manager nodded stiffly. He took the heavy black card and signaled for his lead catering assistant to bring over the wireless payment terminal. The grand foyer was so completely quiet that the electronic beeping of the machine sounded like a fire alarm echoing off the high ceilings. The manager swiped the titanium card through the reader. We all stood in complete silence, waiting for the approval receipt to print and for my family to be thrown out into the street. Instead, the machine let out a loud and continuous negative beep. The general manager looked down at the bright red screen. He cleared his throat nervously and looked directly at Richard. He told the wealthy patriarch that the black card was completely declined. Richard snatched the payment machine right out of the manager's hands. His face turned a deep and angry shade of crimson. He started shouting that a decline was absolutely impossible. He yelled that his primary accounts held tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets and that the machine was obviously broken. He demanded that the manager run the card again and threatened to buy the entire estate just to fire him on the spot. The manager calmly took the card and swiped it a second time. The machine beeped negatively again, declined. Richard looked like he was losing his mind. He pulled out his expensive leather wallet and shoved a second elite platinum card into the terminal. The machine beeped negatively for a third time. Richard began screaming. He pulled out his phone to call his elite wealth management firm. He yelled into the receiver, demanding to know why his personal banking lines were suddenly restricted on the most important day of his daughter's life. I stood quietly watching the powerful billionaire completely unravel in front of his elite guests. I took a slow and deliberate step forward. I told Richard that he did not need to scream at his customer service representative. I told him he should probably look down at the heavy red audit file that was currently resting on the marble floor near his daughter's feet. Richard hung up his phone and glared at me with pure hatred. He demanded to know who I was and why a broke single mother was speaking to him. I kept my voice perfectly calm and entirely professional. I told him he was gravely mistaken about my career. I explained that I was a senior forensic accountant and that my firm specialized in tracking vanished corporate funds and massive financial discrepancies for extremely high net worth individuals. I told Richard that his accounts were not frozen because of a simple banking error or a technical glitch. I explained that exactly 1 month ago, my firm was hired by a silent third-party partner to quietly audit his primary investment portfolio. I watched his arrogant expression instantly falter and crack into genuine fear. I told him we were brought in because someone on his board of directors noticed massive hemorrhaging from his liquid asset accounts. I looked over at Malik, who was now slowly backing toward the massive wooden exit doors. The two armed security guards immediately stepped sideways and completely blocked his path. I turned my attention back to Richard. I told him that I had spent the last 3 weeks tracing a very specific $2 million angel investment he had recently authorized. Richard looked at Malik with wild, panicked eyes. He told me that the $2 million was seed money for Malik's revolutionary new software platform. He said Malik had showed him the beta testing results and the projected financial returns. He claimed the investment was perfectly secure and managed by top-tier brokers who verified Malik's genius. I smiled at him with genuine pity. I told Richard that there was no revolutionary software platform. I told him there was no tech startup at all. I explained that Malik took that $2 million angel investment and funneled it directly into a complex web of offshore shell companies that I had personally tracked and dismantled. I told him that the money did not go into software development or corporate infrastructure. It went directly to paying off the massive debts from his previous secret bankruptcies. It went to funding the entire illusion of a wealthy lifestyle so he could trick Lauren's prestigious family into trusting him. I told Richard that my brother used his stolen investment money to lease the luxury sports cars and rent the downtown penthouse. He used the $2 million to buy the expensive dinners and the designer suits that convinced Richard he was a highly successful equal. I explained that my brother had essentially run a massive Ponzi scheme right under his arrogant nose. Malik was taking money from Richard's own investment portfolio to pay for the illusion that he belonged in their elite world. When those stolen funds started running dangerously low, he resorted to stealing my social security number to open the corporate credit cards that were currently declining all over the wedding venue. I pointed down at the red audit file on the floor. I told Richard that every single forged document and every fake wire transfer was documented right there in that folder. I told him that the federal bank had frozen all of his connected accounts this morning because the federal fraud investigation had officially been triggered by my final audit report. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was deafening. Richard stared at me as the horrifying truth finally pierced through his supreme arrogance. All the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an awful shade of pale gray. He dropped his phone onto the marble floor. The realization that Malik's entire tech company was a massive Ponzi scheme hit him right in the chest. Malik did not even make it halfway across the grand ballroom before his desperate escape came to a violent and pathetic end. He scrambled toward the heavy oak service doors with wild panic in his eyes, completely abandoning whatever dignity he had left. His expensive Italian leather dress shoes had zero traction on the highly polished marble floor, causing his legs to flail out from under him like a terrified child. He scrambled on his hands and knees, knocking over a towering crystal vase filled with imported white orchids. The heavy glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending cold water and crushed flower petals splashing across his custom-tailored tuxedo. It was a beautiful and poetic visual representation of his entire fake life crashing down around him. He scrambled to get back to his feet, but he was far too slow, and the authorities were already closing in from every single direction. The two armed venue security guards who had been blocking the main exit intercepted him first. One of the massive guards grabbed a handful of Malik's expensive silk jacket collar and forcefully yanked him backward. Malik let out a breathless shriek as his feet were swept completely out from under him. He hit the wet marble floor with a sickening and heavy thud that knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to roll over and crawl away, the federal investigators and local police officers were on top of him. Three heavily armed officers slammed their full body weight down onto his back, completely pinning him against the cold and wet stone. Malik thrashed and kicked his legs wildly, screaming that there had been a massive misunderstanding and that he was a wealthy tech CEO who demanded to speak to his lawyers immediately. The lead officer did not entertain a single second of his pathetic delusions. He grabbed Malik's right arm and aggressively twisted it behind his back, forcing his wrist up toward his shoulder blades. The sound of his expensive custom-tailored jacket tearing loudly at the seams echoed through the massive ballroom. A second later, the cold and heavy steel of the police handcuffs aggressively clicked shut around his wrists, locking him into the reality of his criminal choices. The lead investigator pressed his knee firmly between Malik's shoulder blades and began reading him his Miranda rights in a loud and booming voice that carried over the absolute dead silence of the stunned wedding guests. I stood a few feet away, watching my golden child brother sobbing into a puddle of crushed orchids and spilled water. The man who had stolen my identity and ruined my credit score to fund his fake empire was now reduced to a whimpering and helpless criminal lying on his stomach in wet formal wear. I slowly turned my attention away from the pathetic scene on the floor and looked out at the massive crowd of prestigious wedding guests who had witnessed every single second of his spectacular downfall. These were the elite socialites, the wealthy corporate executives, the prominent doctors, and the country club elite that my mother and my brother had been so desperate to impress. Malik had spent $2 million of stolen funds to buy his way into their exclusive circles, and now they were serving as the ultimate audience for his absolute destruction. The grand foyer was illuminated by the harsh and unforgiving glow of dozens of smartphone screens. Every single high society guest in the room had their mobile devices raised high into the air, recording the arrest from every possible angle. The same people who had been sipping expensive champagne and toasting to his fake tech empire just 20 minutes ago were now zooming in on his tear-stained face as he writhed on the floor in handcuffs. The quiet and polite whispers of the wealthy elite had completely vanished. They were openly gasping and gossiping loudly as the details of his massive wire fraud and identity theft rippled through the crowd in real time. The beautiful and carefully curated illusion of black excellence that my family had sacrificed my financial security to maintain was being permanently dismantled and broadcasted live to the entire world. I watched as the prominent wives of local politicians whispered frantically to each other, pointing their manicured fingers at my mother, who was still trembling in the corner. I heard a wealthy investment banker loudly remark that he always knew Malik's software company was a complete sham because the math had never actually made sense. The brutal and unforgiving judgment of high society was crashing down on my family like a tidal wave. In less than an hour, the humiliating videos of Malik being tackled by federal agents would be uploaded to every major social media platform and shared in every elite group chat across the state. His fake empire was entirely dead, and his reputation was permanently incinerated. There would be no recovering from a public spectacle of this massive magnitude. The police officers firmly grabbed Malik by his upper arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. His custom tuxedo was completely ruined, soaked with dirty floor water and covered in crushed flower stems. His perfectly styled hair was a messy disaster, and his face was bloated and red from crying. He tried to duck his head and hide his face from the flashing cameras, But the officers marched him directly through the center of the grand lobby, forcing him to walk the ultimate walk of absolute shame past the very people he had tried to con. My father Vernon stood frozen near the grand staircase watching his only son being dragged away in heavy steel handcuffs. The arrogant and dismissive posture he had carried all morning had completely evaporated, leaving behind an aging and broken man. I watched the horrible realization slowly wash over his tired face as the federal agents escorted Malik out the front doors and into the back of a waiting police cruiser. Vernon finally understood the terrifying and permanent reality of the situation. His golden boy was not just facing a minor civil lawsuit or a simple misunderstanding that could be swept under the rug with a quick apology. Malik had committed massive federal wire fraud, severe identity theft, and grand larceny. He was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary and millions of dollars in mandatory restitution. Vernon looked around the luxurious venue that had just become the site of his family's ultimate disgrace, and he realized that he had absolutely no power left to fix this nightmare. He had no money, no elite connections, and no leverage. The fake wealth was gone, and the creditors were about to seize whatever meager assets they actually owned. In that moment of pure and terrifying clarity, my father's desperate eyes slowly turned away from the exit doors and locked directly onto me. He realized that the daughter he had abandoned and blamed was the only person left in the room who actually possessed real wealth, real power, and a legitimate forensic accounting firm. He took a hesitant and shaking step toward me, preparing to beg for his absolute salvation. My father took another step toward me, and the heavy silence of the grand foyer seemed to magnify the sound of his expensive leather shoes scraping against the marble floor. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside were still casting long, distorted shadows through the massive front windows. But Vernon did not look back at them. He kept his desperate eyes locked entirely on my face. The arrogant and imposing patriarch who had spent my entire life looking down his nose at my career choices was suddenly gone. In his place stood a terrified and broken old man who realized that his only remaining lifeline was the daughter he had spent years treating like absolute garbage. He reached out with a trembling hand and lightly touched my arm, as if he was afraid I might shatter into a million pieces if he squeezed too hard. It was the most gentle physical contact I had ever received from him, and it made my stomach turn with pure disgust. He dropped his voice to a pathetic and pleading whisper, hoping that the catering staff and the few remaining guests would not hear his utter desperation. He told me that we needed to put all of this ugly family drama aside right this very second. He said that Malik was still his son and my brother, and that family had to stick together when things got difficult. He completely ignored the fact that his golden boy had just been arrested for stealing my identity and ruining my credit score. Vernon looked at the heavy red audit file in my hands and swallowed hard. He begged me to pull out my checkbook and pay the $85,000 catering balance immediately. He pleaded with me to pay off the venue manager so we could keep the local press from running the story on the evening news. He told me that if I just posted Malik's federal bail and smoothed over this financial misunderstanding, we could still salvage our family reputation before the country club elite found out the true extent of the damage. I stood perfectly still and stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. The absolute sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He was actually standing in a puddle of water and crushed orchids, begging the victim of a massive financial crime to empty her own bank accounts to rescue the criminal who committed it. He wanted me to use the legitimate wealth I had built from nothing to finance the escape of the golden boy who had tried to destroy me. I did not say a single word. I just let him sweat under the harsh chandelier lighting. My silence pushed Vernon into a state of frantic panic. He realized that his gentle father routine was not working, so he pivoted to the only language he actually understood, which was money and collateral. He grabbed both of my shoulders and leaned in close. His breath smelled like stale champagne and bitter fear. He told me that he was not asking for a handout, and that he would pay me back every single penny with interest. He promised me that he would list the massive family mansion in Atlanta on the real estate market first thing tomorrow morning. He spoke about that house as if it were the crown jewel of our entire existence. It was a sprawling estate with tall white pillars and perfectly manicured lawns that he used to host his lavish networking parties. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon a fraction of his former pride. He swore to me that the property had over $2 million in pure equity. He practically begged me to just float the family for now, promising that as soon as the house sold, I would be made completely whole. A cold and hollow laugh clawed its way up my throat and spilled out of my mouth. The sound echoed sharply against the marble walls, cutting through the tension like a physical blade. It was not a happy sound. It was the dark and cynical laughter of a woman who had spent months untangling a web of generational lies. Vernon physically recoiled from the sound of my laughter. His brow furrowed in deep confusion and genuine offense. He demanded to know what could possibly be funny about our family losing everything. I reached my hand deep into the heavy red audit file and bypassed the highlighted credit card statements and the forged vendor contracts. I pulled out a third document that was printed on thick legal paper and stamped with a certified county clerk seal. I held the crisp, white pages up so the harsh lobby lighting illuminated the dark ink. I looked my father dead in the eyes and watched his false sense of security evaporate. I told him in a clear and unwavering voice that he did not have $2 million in equity. I told him he did not even own the front door of that precious Atlanta mansion anymore. I explained that I had traced the property records while I was auditing Malik's offshore shell companies. I told Vernon that he had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on the family estate exactly 3 years ago. I reminded him of the time Malik launched his very first business venture, the logistics company that my parents had bragged about to every single person at their country club. The company they claimed Malik had sold for a massive profit, making him a self-made millionaire. I told my father that the forensic accounting proved the business was a complete and total failure that hemorrhaged cash from day one. I revealed that Vernon had secretly mortgaged the family home to the absolute hilt just to quietly bail out Malik's failed business and protect the Golden Boy's reputation. I told him the bank owned every single brick of that house, and they were already preparing to foreclose because the mortgage payments had bounced for the last 3 months. Vernon stumbled backward as if I had just shot him in the chest. His hands dropped to his sides and began to shake uncontrollably. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the chandelier lights. He stared at the certified county property deed in my hand and recognized the undeniable truth of his own secret financial ruin. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He looked around the empty lobby, as if searching for a place to hide from his own catastrophic choices. He finally managed to force a breath into his lungs. His voice was nothing more than a ragged and terrified whisper as he stammered out a single broken sentence, asking me how I could possibly know about the secret mortgage. Vernon's voice shook violently as he asked how I could possibly know the intimate details of his private banking records. He looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, standing in the middle of the ruined grand foyer, instead of the daughter he had raised. I smiled at him, but there was absolutely no warmth or forgiveness in my expression. I told my father that he should have been much more careful when he chose to gamble with money that never legally belonged to him in the first place. I watched his tired eyes widen in absolute terror as the puzzle pieces finally began to click together in his slow mind. I told him that I did not just stumble across the secret second mortgage by complete accident while I was auditing Malik's fraudulent offshore accounts. I explained that I actually went looking for it because I knew exactly what kind of desperate financial moves he would make to protect his golden boy from facing real consequences. Patricia was still crying softly in the corner of the lobby, but she suddenly stopped and looked up at me with pure horror written across her tear-stained face. I told them both that I knew exactly how they funded Malik's very first business venture 10 years ago. I watched the blood completely drain from my parents' faces as I finally brought their darkest and most shameful secret out into the bright light of day. I reminded them about the generous college trust fund that my grandfather had legally established for me right before he passed away from a sudden illness. It was supposed to be my absolute guarantee of a safe and secure future and a prestigious university education without the crushing burden of debt. I told Vernon that I knew he and my mother had systematically drained every single penny of my inheritance when I was just 18 years old and completely vulnerable. I described exactly how they forged my signature on the primary release documents and transferred the entire massive balance directly into Malik's personal checking account. I told the empty lobby that my parents stole my entire college fund just to buy their precious son a brand new imported Porsche and to provide the initial seed money for a logistics company that was doomed to fail from the very start. I explained how I was forced to take out crushing student loans and work 3 grueling minimum wage jobs just to survive, while Malik drove around the city in a luxury sports car paid for with my stolen future. I remembered the endless nights I spent crying from pure physical exhaustion while they toasted to his fake success and praised his brilliant entrepreneurial spirit. Vernon tried to open his mouth to offer some pathetic excuse, but I completely cut him off before he could speak a single word. I told him that he had looked me dead in the eyes a decade ago and claimed the volatile stock market had simply wiped out my grandfather's investments overnight. He had lied to my face without shedding a single tear and then told me I needed to pull myself up by my bootstraps while he quietly handed my entire life over to my brother. I took another slow step toward the broken patriarch and told him that his disgusting betrayal was the exact reason I became a forensic accountant in the first place. I did not choose my difficult career path because I loved corporate finance or tax law. I chose it because I needed to possess the absolute highest level of financial clearance to track down every single dollar they had ever stolen from me. I told my parents that I had spent the last entire decade quietly building my professional reputation and honing my investigative skills while they foolishly paraded around the country club thinking they had gotten away with the perfect crime. I explained that I did not just accidentally freeze Malik's fraudulent credit cards this morning on a random whim. I told them that I had been meticulously orchestrating their total and complete financial ruin for an entire year. I explained how I had legally acquired the outstanding debt portfolio from Malik's first failed business through a quiet corporate buyout, using my own legitimate wealth. I told Vernon that my firm was actually the anonymous primary lien holder on their secret second mortgage. I watched his knees physically buckle as he realized that I was the exact person pushing his precious family mansion into aggressive foreclosure. I told them that I had carefully arranged every single falling domino so that their entire fake empire would collapse precisely on the day they thought they had finally secured their ultimate victory. They wanted to humiliate me and cast me aside so they could celebrate their unearned wealth, but I had turned their luxurious wedding day into a federal crime scene. I wanted them to feel the exact same helpless desperation that I felt when I was 18 years old and completely abandoned. My parents stood completely frozen in the wreckage of their shattered lives, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of my calculated revenge. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was heavy and suffocating as the reality of their permanent destruction finally settled into their bones. Before Vernon could even attempt to formulate a single word of apology or beg for another shred of mercy, the heavy sound of polished leather shoes echoed loudly across the ruined marble floor. The general manager of the luxury venue marched directly toward our fractured family, with a thick clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. His face was set in a rigid mask of pure professional fury. He did not offer a polite smile or a customary greeting to the people who had brought a federal raid into his prestigious establishment. He stopped directly in front of my father and shoved a freshly printed invoice straight into Vernon's shaking chest. The manager coldly announced that the massive bill was for the extensive physical damages Malik had caused during his aggressive and humiliating arrest. He loudly listed the completely shattered imported crystal vases, the ruined exotic orchid arrangements, and the deep permanent scratches left in the antique marble flooring from the violent police takedown. He demanded immediate payment for the emergency biohazard cleanup required for the blood and sweat left behind on the pristine carpets. He told Vernon that the police had already secured the perimeter and that nobody in our family was allowed to leave the building until every single cent of the damage was paid for in full. Vernon stared blankly at the itemized invoice in his shaking hands, completely paralyzed by the astronomical numbers printed in bold black ink. He could not even process the financial ruin staring him in the face, because the reality of the situation was moving faster than his slow mind could handle. The general manager did not wait for my father to find his voice or offer another empty promise of payment. He turned his back on Vernon and raised his hand high into the air, signaling his entire event staff to initiate the immediate shutdown protocol. The grand exodus of the most anticipated social event of the year began with a brutal and unforgiving efficiency. It was a spectacular display of organized chaos as dozens of uniformed caterers flooded into the grand ballroom and the foyer with rolling utility carts and heavy plastic storage bins. They did not care about preserving the magical atmosphere or being polite to the bewildered high society guests who were still standing around in their expensive formal wear. The waiters literally marched right up to the stunned corporate executives and wealthy socialites and snatched the crystal champagne flutes directly out of their hands without a single word of apology. I watched as a team of aggressive catering managers descended upon the lavish seafood buffets that my mother had spent months bragging about to her country club friends. They began furiously scooping up the massive silver bowls of imported beluga caviar and tossing them carelessly into heavy, insulated coolers. The towering ice sculptures that had been carved into elegant swans were unceremoniously shoved into rolling garbage bins where they shattered into worthless chunks of frozen water. The entire illusion of absolute luxury was being systematically dismantled right in front of our eyes. Over in the corner of the ballroom, the expensive celebrity DJ, who had been hired to provide the perfect romantic soundtrack for the evening, abruptly cut the music. The sudden and deafening silence in the massive venue was jarring and deeply uncomfortable. The DJ did not even bother to announce that the party was over. He just started aggressively ripping thick black audio cables out of the wall sockets and hastily packing his expensive sound equipment into heavy metal transport cases. The beautiful venue was being stripped completely bare at a terrifying speed. The extravagant silk tablecloths were yanked away, causing silverware and expensive china plates to clatter loudly against each other as they were tossed into plastic bus tubs. The elite wedding guests did not need any further prompting to realize that the fraudulent circus was officially over. The whispers of shock and horror had evolved into a frantic and desperate rush for the main exit. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family that was currently being investigated for massive federal wire fraud and grand larceny. The prominent doctors and local politicians gathered their expensive silk wraps and hurried toward the valet stand, refusing to make eye contact with my parents as they fled the scene. Through the middle of this chaotic stampede, Richard stood like an angry titan shielding his sobbing daughter from the flashing smartphone cameras and the staring eyes of their peers. He had a firm and protective grip on Lauren's arm, guiding her away from the shattered glass and the ruined flower arrangements that littered the marble floor. Lauren was weeping hysterically, her designer wedding gown trailing through the spilled water and crushed orchids making her look like a tragic figure from a nightmare. She was completely inconsolable as her dreams of marrying a wealthy tech genius were brutally replaced by the reality of being engaged to a broke federal criminal. Before Richard led his daughter through the heavy oak doors, he stopped and turned his massive frame back toward my father. Vernon instinctively shrank backward under the crushing weight of the billionaire's pure, unadulterated hatred. Richard did not shout or lose his temper again because his voice was dangerously calm and cold, which made it infinitely more terrifying. He told Vernon that the absolute worst mistake of his miserable life was allowing his pathetic con artist of a son to drag Lauren into this disgusting spectacle. He promised my father that he was going to unleash his entire massive legal team on our family first thing tomorrow morning. He swore that he would sue Vernon and Patricia into absolute oblivion for the emotional distress and the severe public humiliation they had inflicted on his only daughter. He leaned in close and promised my father that by the time his corporate lawyers were finished, there would not be a single cent left to their names, and no bank in the world would ever look at them again. He vowed to make sure that Vernon spent the rest of his pathetic life drowning in endless litigation and crushing legal fees. Richard did not wait for Vernon to respond to the devastating ultimatum. He turned his back on my broken father and marched Lauren out into the cold evening air. Through the massive front windows, I watched as a fleet of shiny black luxury SUVs pulled up to the curb. Heavily armed private security details surrounded Richard and Lauren as they climbed into the back of the lead vehicle, shielding them from any lingering guests. The heavy doors slammed shut with a final, resounding thud. I stood in the echoing silence of the stripped foyer and watched the red taillights of the billionaire convoy fade away into the darkness, completely severing Malik's final connection to the elite world he had tried to steal his way into. The grand venue was now entirely empty except for the aggressive cleanup crew and the pathetic remnants of my family. The beautiful floral arches were gone, the champagne towers were dismantled, and the luxurious atmosphere had been replaced by the harsh clinical smell of industrial cleaning supplies. It was just me, my father and my mother standing in the cold and empty ruins of their ultimate failure. Patricia had remained entirely silent during the chaotic exodus, cowering in the corner like a frightened child, while her fake social empire crumbled to dust right in front of her country club friends. But as the reality of Richard's legal threats and the absolute certainty of the bank foreclosure finally pierced through her deep denial, she completely cracked. She let out a guttural and agonizing wail that echoed terribly against the high ceilings of the empty hall. My mother dropped straight down onto her hands and knees, right in the middle of the wet and scratched marble floor. She did not care that her expensive designer gown was soaking up dirty water, or that the heavy pearl necklace around her throat was clattering harshly against the cold stone. The sophisticated and arrogant matriarch, who had spent 10 years treating me like absolute garbage, had been completely destroyed by the consequences of her own actions. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her chest heaving with desperate and ugly gasps for air. Her perfect professional makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark black streaks of mascara and mixing with the puddle on the floor. She crawled across the wet marble toward me, completely abandoning every single ounce of her precious pride and dignity. She reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the hem of my dress, clutching the fabric like it was a life preserver in a stormy ocean. Patricia tilted her tear-stained face up toward me and began begging me to save them from the nightmare they had created. She wailed that they were going to be completely homeless and destitute, and that she could not survive living on the streets. She pleaded with me to use my newly revealed wealth to pay off the secret second mortgage and save the family mansion from the bank foreclosure. I looked down at my mother as she wept on the cold marble floor. Patricia was a woman who had spent my entire life obsessing over appearances and social standing. She had always treated me like an embarrassing stain on her perfect family portrait. Now she was clutching the fabric of my dress and begging me to save her from the consequences of her own horrific choices. Her tears soaked into the material of my skirt, but I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for her. I felt nothing but a cold and absolute finality. I slowly stepped backward, forcing her to release her grip on my clothes. I told her to get up off the floor because her performance was completely useless. I told her that all the crying and begging in the world was not going to magically rewrite history or put the stolen money back into my college trust fund. I reminded her of every single time she had looked down her nose at my forensic accounting career, calling it boring and entirely beneath the family name. Now that very same career was the only thing standing between her and absolute destitution, and she was perfectly willing to sacrifice whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left to exploit it. Vernon watched us from a few feet away, looking like a ghost haunting his own ruined life. His broad shoulders were completely slumped and his chest was heaving with irregular and shallow breaths. The imposing and aggressive patriarch who had threatened me earlier was completely gone. He took a hesitant and shaking step toward me and echoed my mother's pathetic pleas. He dropped his aggressive act entirely and begged me to post Malik's federal bail. He pleaded with me to pay off the furious venue manager and avoid the horrific press coverage that was about to ruin their lives. He promised me that he would sell the family mansion in Atlanta immediately to pay me back every single cent. He swore that they had at least $2 million in pure equity tied up in the estate. He begged me to just float them for now, promising that the upcoming house sale would solve all of their terrifying problems. I calmly reached into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The heavy paper was sealed with a firm wax stamp and carried the official crest of a highly prominent Atlanta real estate law firm. I held it out toward my father. Vernon reached for it with trembling hands. His eyes lit up with a sudden and pathetic flash of hope. He genuinely believed that the envelope contained a certified bank check or a legal agreement that would magically float his debts. He thought I was actually going to bail him out and wait for him to sell his precious house. I watched his shaking fingers tear open the top flap of the thick envelope. Before he could pull the documents out, I looked directly into his desperate eyes and let out a cold and hollow laugh. I told my father that his math was completely wrong and that he did not have $2 million in equity. I explained that he and my mother had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage to bail out Malik's first failed business years ago. I told them that my forensic audit had tracked their financial neglect perfectly, and I knew for an absolute fact that they had not made a single payment to the bank in exactly 9 months. Vernon's face went completely rigid as the truth hit him. I told him that they had spent the entire year ignoring certified letters and burying their heads in the sand. I explained that the grace period had fully expired, and the massive family mansion had officially gone into total foreclosure yesterday morning while they were busy preparing for this fake wedding. Patricia let out another agonizing wail from the floor. She screamed that it was completely impossible because the bank had not locked them out. I told her that the bank did not need to lock them out because the property had already been quietly sold at a private commercial auction. Vernon dropped the envelope and clutched his chest. He stammered out that some faceless corporate entity had stolen his home for pennies on the dollar. I smiled at him with a chilling and absolute calm. I told my father that he was entirely correct about the private corporate entity. I explained the complex process of distressed asset buyouts and how elite wealth management firms acquire foreclosed properties through anonymous holding companies. I told him the exact name of the limited liability corporation that had purchased the deed to the Atlanta mansion yesterday afternoon. Vernon recognized the corporate name immediately because it was the exact same holding company that had acquired the massive debt portfolio from Malik's failed logistics business. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the horrifying realization finally clicked into place. I looked back at both of my parents and delivered the ultimate killing blow. I told them that I was the anonymous buyer and the sole managing director of that holding company. I explained that I had used my own legitimate wealth to purchase the foreclosed debt directly from the bank. I told Vernon that he no longer owed money to a faceless lending institution. He owed everything to me. I explained that I was now the sole legal owner of the sprawling Atlanta estate. I told him that I owned every single brick, every massive white pillar, and every perfectly manicured blade of grass on that property. I had completely bought the family mansion out from under them while they were blindly celebrating their golden child's fake success. I told them that the house they had repeatedly used to make me feel small and insignificant now belonged entirely to the daughter they had thrown away. Vernon looked down at the heavy manila envelope he had dropped on the wet marble floor. The thick legal documents had partially slid out of the opening. He slowly reached down and picked up the crisp white pages. I told him he should read the bold text at the very top of the primary document. It was not a deed transfer back into his name, and it was certainly not a financial bailout. I watched his eyes scan the harsh legal terminology as the final nail was driven into his coffin. I told my father that the document in his hands was a formal and legally binding 30-day eviction notice. I explained that they had exactly 1 month to pack up whatever cheap possessions they had left and permanently vacate my property. Vernon stood completely paralyzed holding the eviction notice as he finally stammered out a broken sentence asking me how I could possibly know about the secret mortgage and orchestrate their complete destruction. I watched the exact moment the last remaining shred of his arrogant pride evaporated from his eyes, leaving behind nothing but a hollow and terrifying emptiness. Vernon was shaking so violently that the heavy parchment paper of the eviction notice rattled loudly in the silent foyer. The man who had spent my entire life towering over me, dictating my worth and controlling my future, was now shrinking before my very eyes. The power dynamic that had defined our toxic family for 3 decades had just been permanently and violently inverted. He was no longer the untouchable patriarch of a wealthy Southern dynasty. He was just a terrified old man holding a piece of paper that legally stripped him of his sanctuary and his entire identity. He looked at me as if I possessed some kind of dark magic, unable to comprehend how the daughter he had consistently dismissed as a boring accountant could have orchestrated such a flawless and devastating trap. I stepped closer to him and kept my voice completely devoid of any emotion as I broke down exactly how I had legally outmaneuvered them. I wanted him to understand every single detail of his failure. I told him that real estate law was completely unforgiving when it came to commercial debt defaults, especially when you try to hide them. I explained that when they took out that desperate second mortgage for $1.8 million to save Malik's sinking logistics company, they had foolishly used the primary family estate as collateral through a high-risk shadow lender. They had assumed the private lender would grant them endless leniency because of their prestigious country club connections and their family name. But I told Vernon that shadow lenders only care about liquidity and cold hard cash. When their payments quietly stopped 9 months ago, the lender did not care about their social standing. The debt was quietly bundled into a distressed asset portfolio and listed on a private commercial exchange for a fraction of its original value. I watched his jaw drop as the cold, hard numbers finally penetrated his thick skull. I told Vernon that my firm specializes in tracking distressed high-value assets, and I had personally flagged the property the very moment it hit the dark market. I did not have to break a single law or pull a single underhanded trick to take his house. I simply bought their bad debt for exactly 62 cents on the dollar using an anonymous shell corporation so my name would never appear on the public registry until the foreclosure was absolutely finalized. I explained that the 30-day eviction notice he was holding was actually a generous courtesy, because under the specific and aggressive terms of their defaulted shadow loan, I legally had the right to request an immediate lockout order from the county sheriff. I reminded him that I had warned him years ago that his reckless financial favoritism toward Malik would eventually catch up with him, but he had just laughed in my face and told me to stick to my little spreadsheets. Now those exact spreadsheets had mapped out his complete and total ruin. I let his own greed and financial incompetence do all the heavy lifting while I quietly waited with my checkbook ready. Patricia was still kneeling on the wet marble floor listening to me clinically dissect their financial destruction. The desperate wailing had slowly stopped, replaced by a frantic and calculating look in her tear-stained eyes. She realized that treating me like a bitter enemy was not going to work anymore, so she immediately pivoted to her absolute favorite manipulative tactic. She slowly dragged herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against a cracked marble pillar for physical support. She wiped the running black mascara from her cheeks with the back of her hand and plastered on a sickeningly sweet expression of maternal concern that made my stomach turn. She told me that I was making a terrible and impulsive mistake, fueled by old misunderstandings that we could easily talk through. She took a hesitant step toward me and reached out her trembling hand, telling me that we were still a family and that families always forgive each other when things get difficult. When I did not react to her empty and pathetic words, she dropped the ultimate guilt trip. She brought up my 4-year-old son, Leo. Patricia's voice trembled with fake emotional devotion as she told me that little Leo needed his grandparents in his life now more than ever. She said it would be incredibly cruel of me to deprive an innocent child of the loving family home where his mother had grown up. She painted this grand and pathetic picture of us celebrating future holidays together in the formal dining room, watching Leo open expensive presents by the massive marble fireplace. She begged me to think about what was best for my son, claiming that a growing boy desperately needs the stability and unconditional love of his extended family. She had the absolute audacity to use my own child as a human shield to protect her precious mansion and her lavish lifestyle. I felt a sudden surge of pure white-hot rage burning in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly still. The absolute nerve of this woman to invoke my son's name after she had deliberately ignored his existence for his entire life was truly unbelievable. I looked her dead in the eyes and asked her if she even knew when Leo's birthday was. Patricia froze instantly, her outstretched hand dropping slightly as her mouth opened and closed in silent panic. She stammered out a pathetic excuse about being bad with dates and having so much on her mind lately, but the truth was painfully obvious to everyone in the room. I told her that she had never sent him a single birthday card, never attended a single childhood milestone, and had actively refused to come to the hospital when he was born, because she was too busy attending a charity gala with Malik's latest girlfriend. I reminded her that when I was struggling as a single mother working 70-hour weeks to build my firm, she had told her country club friends that my pregnancy was an embarrassment that had ruined my life. I told her that Leo did not need toxic grandparents who viewed him as a shameful secret, and he certainly did not need to grow up in an environment where love was conditional and tied directly to a bank account. When her desperate begging about living on the streets failed to elicit a single ounce of sympathy from me, Patricia desperately shifted her tactics and decided to weaponize the one thing she thought could still break my iron resolve. She dragged herself up from the wet marble floor and leaned heavily against a cracked decorative pillar while she desperately tried to arrange her ruined face into a mask of pure grandmotherly devotion. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes and told me that if I did not care about her or Vernon, I at least had to think about my innocent 4-year-old son Leo. Patricia had the absolute, unmitigated audacity to tell me that a growing child desperately needs the unconditional love and stability of his grandparents. She painted a sickeningly sweet and entirely fictional picture of us celebrating future holidays together in the grand dining room and watching little Leo open expensive gifts by the massive marble fireplace. She tried to guilt-trip me by claiming that it would be incredibly cruel and selfish of me to legally evict them and deprive my own child of the beautiful family estate where his mother had grown up. Just as the toxic words left her lying mouth, the heavy oak door leading to the west wing of the foyer slowly creaked open. My precious son Leo wandered out into the grand entryway, rubbing his sleepy eyes while clutching his faded blue stuffed bear against his small chest. The loud screaming and the chaotic noise of the catering crew dismantling the ballroom had obviously woken him up from his nap in the back sitting room. The very second Patricia spotted him, her eyes lit up with a predatory gleam, and she took a sudden step toward him, cooing his name as if she wanted to pull him into a loving embrace for the benefit of the few remaining event staff. I did not even give her the chance to close the distance. I moved faster than she could ever anticipate and placed my body directly between my vulnerable child and the toxic woman who had birthed me. I immediately crouched down on the cold marble floor and opened my arms. Leo ran straight into my embrace, burying his small face into the crook of my neck to hide from the frightening atmosphere of the ruined wedding venue. I wrapped my arms securely around his trembling shoulders and reached up to firmly press the palms of my hands over his little ears. I was absolutely determined to physically shield his innocent mind from hearing another single word of poison from the people who had spent my entire life breaking me down. I held him tightly against my chest, while I looked up at my mother with a glare so filled with pure, unadulterated fury that it made her physically take a step backward. I kept my hands firmly pressed over Leo's ears, as I finally unleashed every single ounce of maternal rage that I had been holding back for 4 agonizing years. I told Patricia that she had absolutely no right to speak my son's name or pretend to care about his future after the disgusting way she had treated him since the very moment he took his first breath. I forced her to stand there and listen as I methodically detailed every single unforgivable sin she and Vernon had committed against my child. I reminded her of the lavish country club luncheon 2 years ago when Leo had simply been overwhelmed by the loud noises and the crowds. I described exactly how she had looked me dead in the eyes and called my beautiful, innocent son weird and embarrassing in front of her wealthy friends. I reminded her that she had deliberately hired a nanny to lock him away in the remote upstairs nursery during every single family holiday party because she was terrified that his totally normal childhood behavior would somehow ruin her elegant and sophisticated aesthetic. I told her that I knew she had specifically instructed the expensive professional photographer to crop Leo out of the massive family portrait that hung in the hallway just because his comfortable sensory-friendly clothes did not match the designer formal wear she had forced the rest of the family to buy. I watched the color completely drain from my mother's face as I threw every single instance of her cruel and calculated neglect right back at her. I reminded Vernon that he had completely ignored Leo's third birthday, choosing instead to take Malik on an expensive weekend golfing trip to celebrate another one of his fraudulent business milestones. I told them that they had spent his entire life treating him like a defective and shameful secret that needed to be hidden away in the shadows simply because he did not fit perfectly into their shallow and superficial country club mold. They had systematically tried to make my son feel like an unwanted burden, exactly like they had done to me when I was growing up, and I was absolutely never going to allow them to repeat that vicious cycle of generational trauma on my child. I pulled Leo even closer to my heart and delivered the absolute final severance to the people who used to be my parents. I told Patricia that my son did not need toxic and pathetic grandparents who viewed his unique and wonderful personality as a defect. I promised her that he would never have to beg for scraps of conditional love from people who valued a marble mansion over their own flesh and blood, because he had a mother who viewed him as an absolute king. I swore that I would use every single dollar of my legitimate wealth and every ounce of my power to build an empire for him, where he would always be celebrated and protected. I told them that the absolute greatest gift I could ever give my child was permanently excising them from our lives forever. The suffocating silence that followed my declaration was heavy and permanent. Patricia completely crumpled against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the wet floor, unable to formulate a single word of defense. But Vernon reacted completely differently. The sheer magnitude of his absolute failure combined with the humiliating realization that he had lost all of his manipulative leverage finally broke his fragile and arrogant ego. In a pathetic and desperate display of pure, petulant, childish anger, Vernon lunged forward and snatched the heavy manila envelope containing the 30-day eviction notice right off the floor. He gripped the thick legal documents in his shaking hands and let out a strange, primal groan of rage. He began frantically tearing the crisp white pages into tiny shredded pieces, ripping the foreclosure notices and the eviction mandates with wild and aggressive jerks of his arms. He let the shredded pieces of paper fall like snow to the wet marble floor around his expensive leather shoes, acting like a complete toddler throwing a tantrum. He actually believed that by physically destroying the paper, he could somehow magically stop the massive legal machine that had already taken his home and his legacy. I stood there holding my son tightly against my chest and simply watched my father rip the thick legal documents into tiny shreds. The heavy pieces of premium parchment fluttered down like dirty snow, landing in the puddles of spilled water and crushed orchids that covered the marble floor. Vernon was panting heavily, his face completely flushed with a dangerous shade of crimson. He looked down at the shredded mess at his feet, with a bizarre look of wild triumph, as if destroying a single copy of a legal notice could somehow magically reverse a federal foreclosure and wipe away millions of dollars in debt. I did not yell or try to stop his pathetic tantrum. I just offered him a cold, pitying smile and told him that my law firm had already filed the original documents with the county clerk and mailed certified copies to his fake corporate office. I explained that shredding a piece of paper did not change the absolute fact that the local sheriff would be arriving at his front gates in exactly 30 days to physically remove him and his possessions from my property. The stark reality of my words echoed loudly through the ruined grand foyer. The massive space was no longer filled with the romantic string quartet or the clinking of expensive champagne flutes, but the silence was far from absolute. I glanced over Vernon's shaking shoulder and noticed the audience that had quietly lingered in the shadows. While the majority of the elite wedding guests had fled the scene the moment the federal agents arrived, a select group of extended family members and Patricia's closest country club rivals had stayed behind. They were standing near the grand staircase, and the coat check completely mesmerized by the spectacular implosion of the Washington family dynasty. These were the exact same wealthy socialites and prominent board members that my mother had spent her entire life desperately trying to impress. They were the people she had lied to for decades, pretending that our family was a picture of generational wealth and flawless Southern grace. Now they were watching Vernon act like a petulant toddler while Patricia sat weeping in a puddle of dirty water. I watched as manicured hands flew up to cover gasping mouths. I saw the glowing screens of expensive smartphones subtly angled toward us, recording every single humiliating second of my parents' total destruction. The whispers started instantly spreading through the remaining crowd like a vicious wildfire. The hushed voices carried across the marble floor discussing how the mighty Washingtons were completely broke and facing federal prison. I could hear them piecing the scandalous puzzle together, murmuring about how Patricia had been wearing borrowed jewelry and how Vernon had been drowning in debt while bragging about his fake empire. The elite social circle that my mother worshipped was actively tearing her reputation to shreds. They were whispering about the foreclosed mansion and the stolen trust fund, looking at my parents with absolute disgust and gleeful pity. The perfect illusion was completely shattered, and the perfect Washington family was exposed as broke, fraudulent, and unbelievably cruel. There was absolutely no coming back from this total social execution. Patricia slowly turned her head and finally noticed the staring audience. Her tear-streaked face drained of whatever color it had left. I watched the absolute horror wash over her as she made eye contact with the president of the local country club. The woman did not offer my mother a sympathetic smile or step forward to help her up from the wet floor. She just looked at Patricia with pure cold contempt and turned her back on her, whispering frantically to her husband. My mother let out a strangled gasp, realizing that she was officially a social pariah. She would never be invited to another charity gala, she would never sit on another prestigious committee, and she would never be able to show her face in their exclusive neighborhoods ever again. The realization that she was entirely bankrupt and publicly humiliated finally broke the last remaining thread of her sanity. When narcissists are backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate, they inevitably turn their vicious claws on each other. Patricia scrambled up from the wet floor, her designer dress clinging to her legs like a heavy, wet rag. She did not look at me or apologize for the horrific things she had done. Instead, she turned her furious and wild eyes directly onto Vernon. She let out a piercing scream that made the remaining guests jump backward in shock. She shoved her finger directly into my father's chest and shrieked that this nightmare was entirely his fault. She accused him of being a pathetic failure of a businessman who had gambled away their entire fortune on stupid, risky investments just to stroke his own massive ego. She screamed that he had ruined her life and stripped her of the luxury she rightfully deserved. Vernon slapped her hand away and roared back at her with equal venom. The veins in his neck were bulging as he screamed that she was a delusional parasite who had drained his bank accounts dry to fund her pathetic shopping addictions and massive country club dues. The foyer erupted into a vicious and brutal screaming match as years of toxic resentment boiled over in front of everyone. Vernon shouted that Patricia was the one who had hopelessly spoiled Malik, turning him into a lazy, entitled criminal by giving him whatever he wanted and constantly covering up all of his miserable mistakes. He blamed her for treating Malik like a god while bleeding their finances dry. Patricia fired right back, screaming that Vernon was the one who taught Malik how to cheat and steal in the corporate world because Vernon himself was nothing but a cheap fraud. They stood in the wreckage of their fake empire, violently tearing each other apart and blaming one another for the absolute monster they had created. I stood there for a long moment, completely paralyzed, not by fear but by a profound and overwhelming sense of absolute clarity, as I watched the two people who had brought me into this world violently tear each other to pieces. Their vicious insults and desperate accusations bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer, echoing through the cavernous space like the dying gasps of a ruined empire. The words simply did not reach me anymore. For my entire life, I had been absolutely terrified of their anger and completely controlled by their disapproval. I had spent countless childhood nights crying into my pillow, desperately trying to figure out how to make them love me and how to earn just a tiny fraction of their elusive validation. I used to look at them and think they were these flawless, untouchable giants who held all the power and dictated all the rules. But looking at them now, screaming until their faces were purple and blaming each other for their own greedy mistakes, I realized they were just small, pathetic, and incredibly weak individuals. They had no real loyalty to anyone, and certainly not to each other. The very second their fake wealth evaporated, their entire marriage evaporated right along with it. I realized with crystal clarity that I did not need to say another single word to either of them. The ultimate revenge was not shouting them down or trading insults. The ultimate punishment was simply leaving them exactly as they were, trapped in a foreclosed mansion with nothing but their massive debts and their own miserable company. I slowly lowered my hands from the sides of Leo's small head, gently uncovering his ears, as the chaotic screaming behind us devolved into frantic and incoherent shouting. I looked down into his beautiful, innocent brown eyes and felt a massive wave of pure, unconditional love wash over my entire being, completely erasing the lingering toxicity of the room. He was completely unharmed and totally oblivious to the generational curses that had just been permanently broken and shattered on this cold marble floor. He looked up at me, clutching his faded blue stuffed bear against his chest, and tilted his head with a silent and trusting question in his eyes. I did not want him to spend another single second breathing the poisoned air of this house, or standing in the shadows of people who would never understand his worth. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that bubbled up from the very bottom of my soul, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. I reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from his forehead. I smiled warmly at my beautiful son and told him that we were completely finished here. I looked deep into his eyes and said, "Let's go get that pizza, buddy." Leo instantly beamed with pure childlike excitement, completely unaffected by the devastating social execution happening just a few feet away. I stood up gracefully and took his small, warm hand securely in mine. We turned our backs on Vernon and Patricia and began walking toward the massive front doors of the estate. I did not look back over my shoulder even once. I did not care that Vernon was currently screaming at the top of his lungs about calling his corporate lawyers, or that Patricia was wailing hysterically about her permanently ruined reputation. I walked right past the cluster of terrified country club guests and gossiping socialites who were still huddled near the coat check, recording the disaster on their phones. I could feel their shocked eyes burning into the back of my neck, and I could hear their frantic whispering, spreading the news of the Washington family downfall. But those people meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. Their elite, superficial world was a poisonous trap, and I was finally walking out of it forever. My posture was incredibly light, and my spine was perfectly straight. I felt as though a crushing physical weight had just been surgically removed from my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating burden of constantly seeking their validation and desperately trying to prove my worth to a family that never wanted me had completely vanished. I was no longer the disappointing and overlooked daughter. I was simply Carmen, a fiercely successful woman, and a devoted mother who had just reclaimed her entire life and her future. The atmosphere inside the grand foyer felt impossibly dark and suffocating, as if the massive stone walls themselves were actively absorbing the toxic misery of my parents' ruined lives. The air was thick with the sickening smell of spilled champagne, crushed decorative orchids, and absolute catastrophic failure. But directly ahead of me, the massive double oak doors stood waiting like a gateway to a completely different universe. Bright, brilliant sunlight was spilling through the intricate decorative glass panels, casting a warm, golden glow across the wet and ruined marble floor. I reached out and pushed the heavy brass handle, throwing the doors wide open and stepping across the threshold. The transition was instant and absolutely breathtaking. The crisp, clean outside air hit my face and filled my lungs with the sweet taste of pure, unadulterated freedom. The warm afternoon sun washed over my skin, instantly melting away the cold dampness and the suffocating shadows of the miserable mansion. I took a deep, cleansing breath and felt my heart beat with a steady, peaceful rhythm that I had never experienced before in my entire life. I held Leo's hand tightly as we stepped out onto the massive stone porch, leaving the dark and chaotic venue behind us forever. As we confidently crossed the threshold, the heavy wooden double doors swung shut behind us with a loud and absolute thud. That single resounding sound was the final punctuation mark on my past. It instantly cut off the muffled sounds of Vernon's raging tantrums and Patricia's pathetic weeping, completely sealing them inside the self-made prison of their own destructive greed. They were locked away in the dark with nothing but their mountainous debts and their exposed lies, while I was standing outside in the radiant and beautiful light. I walked down the sweeping front steps toward my parked car, matching my pace to Leo's happy skipping footsteps. I looked up at the endless expanse of the bright blue sky and felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace settle over my soul. The future stretching out before us was completely bright and incredibly sunny. It was a beautiful future that I was going to build entirely on my own terms, completely free from the ghosts of the past, and filled with the kind of unconditional love my parents could never even begin to comprehend. Exactly 6 months had passed since that chaotic afternoon, when I walked out of the massive oak doors of the Washington estate and never looked back. The bitter, freezing chill of that ruined marble foyer was now nothing more than a distant, fading memory, completely replaced by the gentle, warm breeze of the Caribbean Sea. I sat comfortably on a plush white lounge chair under the shade of a woven palm umbrella, listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the turquoise waves gently crashing against the pristine white sand. The air smelled of salt and sweet coconut, and for the first time in my entire 30 years of existence, my chest felt completely light. There was no lingering anxiety, no suffocating pressure to perform, and absolutely no dark shadows of generational trauma hanging over my head. I took a deep breath of the warm tropical air and let my eyes drift down the private stretch of beach until they landed on the absolute center of my entire universe. Leo was kneeling happily in the soft, wet sand, completely absorbed in his own magical world. He was wearing his favorite seamless, sensory-friendly swimsuit, the bright yellow one that my mother had always despised and claimed was far too loud for a proper family photograph. Now that bright yellow fabric shone like a beacon of pure joy under the tropical sun. He was busy constructing a massive, sprawling sandcastle near the edge of the water, using a collection of brightly colored plastic buckets and shovels. He was humming a happy little tune to himself, his face completely relaxed and glowing with pure, unbothered childhood innocence. I watched as he carefully patted the wet sand to form a tall tower, his intense focus completely uninterrupted. He was no longer the quiet, anxious child who was forced to hide in the remote upstairs nursery so he would not embarrass the family. Out here under the endless blue sky, he was absolutely thriving. He was a king, building his own beautiful kingdom entirely safe and unconditionally loved. I smiled as I watched him scoop another bucket of sand, feeling an overwhelming surge of maternal pride that brought happy tears to my eyes. A soft chime from my phone resting on the small wooden side table briefly pulled my attention away from my beautiful son. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen, finding a detailed final report from the senior legal team at my firm. It was the absolute last update I would ever need regarding the miserable people who used to be my family. I slowly scrolled through the long email, reading the final official outcomes of the Washington family collapse. The justice they had all received was so poetic and absolute that it felt like it had been scripted by fate itself. The first paragraph detailed the final verdict for my golden child brother. Malik had stood before a federal judge earlier this week, desperately trying to charm his way out of the massive corporate fraud charges that had completely destroyed his logistics company. His arrogant smirk and his tailored suits were absolutely useless in a federal courtroom. The judge had seen right through his entitled facade and sentenced him to a mandatory 5 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His days of flying private and burning through stolen money were officially over, replaced by a bleak concrete cell. The email then casually mentioned his fake bride, Lauren. After the horrific implosion of their sham wedding, Lauren had desperately scrambled to secure her precious social standing. Unable to face the humiliation of losing her country club status, she had hastily married a 60-year-old billionaire with a terrible reputation. She had willingly trapped herself in a miserable, loveless marriage, essentially selling her soul just so she could keep wearing designer clothes and attending elite charity galas. She was exactly where she belonged, living a completely fake life, fueled by pure, superficial greed. But the most satisfying part of the email was the final update on Vernon and Patricia. The mighty Washington patriarch and his elitist snob of a wife had experienced a fall from grace so spectacular that it was still the primary topic of gossip in their former social circles. After I had legally evicted them from the sprawling estate, their secret shadow debts had completely swallowed whatever tiny scraps of cash they had left hidden away. Their wealthy friends had completely abandoned them the very second their fraud was exposed. Now they were living in a cramped, dark, two-bedroom apartment on the absolute wrong side of the city. To survive and pay their mounting legal fees, both of them had been forced to take minimum-wage retail jobs. I could clearly picture Vernon taking orders from a manager half his age, his massive ego suffocating under the harsh fluorescent lights of a big box store. I could imagine Patricia standing on her aching feet for 8 hours a day, folding cheap clothes and dealing with rude customers, terrified that someone from her old country club might walk in and recognize her. They were finally experiencing the exact same grueling, exhausting struggle that they had always mocked other people for enduring. Their fake empire was gone, and they were left with absolutely nothing but their own bitter resentment. I kept scrolling down the email to the final confirmation attached at the bottom. The sale of the Washington family estate was officially closed and fully funded. I had absolutely no desire to keep that massive cursed house. The walls held too many dark memories of emotional abuse and conditional love, so I had listed it on the commercial market the very second the foreclosure cleared. It had sold for a massive premium, and I took every single cent of that incredible profit and poured it into something pure and beautiful. I had used their stolen wealth to officially open a state-of-the-art, sensory-friendly learning center for neurodivergent children right in the heart of Atlanta. I named the facility the Leo Foundation. It was a massive, beautiful space filled with specialized educators, therapists, and incredible resources designed to help children exactly like my son thrive and grow without ever feeling like they were broken or weird. I took the physical monument of my parents' toxic pride and magically transformed it into a legacy of absolute unconditional love and radical acceptance. The money they had hoarded to make themselves feel superior was now actively funding the very children they had always looked down on. I reached the bottom of the email and felt a profound sense of total closure wash over my heart. The story was completely finished. The chapter was permanently closed. I pressed the power button on my phone, completely blacking out the screen, and tossed it carelessly back onto the wooden table. I did not need to read another word or hear another update ever again. I stood up from my comfortable lounge chair and felt the warm white sand instantly mold around my bare feet. I walked slowly toward the sparkling turquoise water, where Leo was proudly adding a moat to his massive sandy fortress. He looked up and gave me a brilliant gap-toothed smile that instantly melted my entire heart. I dropped down onto my knees right there in the wet sand, completely ruining my expensive cover-up, and I did not care at all. I grabbed a small blue plastic shovel and started digging in the sand right next to my beautiful boy, laughing out loud as the warm ocean water rushed up to tickle our toes. I looked out at the endless beautiful horizon and felt a level of total unbothered peace that I could never fully describe. I finally understood that the absolute sweetest revenge was not destruction or anger. The absolute sweetest revenge was simply a life beautifully and unapologetically lived